Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian Online Seminar Group. First, then if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker during his presentation or after his presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming dear Professor John Dumay. John Dumay is a professor of accounting and finance at Macquarie Business School, Sydney, Australia. John is a critical scholar researching modern slavery, sustainability, and corporate disclosure and has over 150 peer-reviewed publications. His research has been published in top-ranking journals in accounting. The Australian newspaper recognized John as Australia's leading accounting scholar. He is an associate editor of Accounting, Auditing, and Accountability Journal and a Mediterranean Accountancy Journal Research, and a deputy editor of Accounting and Finance. Now we will start our seminar with dear Professor John Dumay.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thanks everybody for joining in. I'm very happy to be here as part of the group today to share the research. Normally I'm in Australia, but fortunately the time zone's a little bit better for me because I'm now in Italy, so we're only about an hour's difference to Cairo. So my research, I think I really want to put out first and foremost that I really don't even consider myself sometimes an accounting scholar so much as a social scientist, because the kind of work I like to do, the research I like to do is about how society interacts with accounting, and more specifically in this case, what we're going to be talking about is sustainability accounting and a research project that I've been working on. And I think another thing is that don't expect a traditional type of presentation with some hypotheses and literature review and that type of thing, because that's not kind of research that I'm going to be talking about today. As Mohammed said, I'm a critical scholar, so I like to think fairly deeply about the impacts of the research that we're doing and what the wider ramifications of that is. So the research project I'm going to talk about is one that I've been involved with for quite some time in the cocoa industry, chocolate industry. But I'm also thinking about the wider implications of what we're doing with that. We were having a bit of a chat beforehand about how often we put a lot of pressure on companies through sustainability reporting and so forth to get them to change their ways and hopefully make the world a more sustainable place. But in reality, it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think what we're going to find is that as we go through this presentation today, that the world is a much more complicated place. So this is definitely a social and environmental accounting presentation, or sustainability accounting presentation. So we're not talking about balance sheets and monetary. We talk a little bit about money, but we've got a lot of different numbers in here as well. So there's quite a bit of an accounting in here, but not so much in a more traditional sense. So the paper is driving productivity in the cocoa supply chain through shared value. And shared value, we're going to be talking about the Porterian view, the Harvard view of how large corporations obtain supplies of raw materials in developing nations. And that's definitely a business model that's being applied in the cocoa industry at the moment. So I'm going to have a little bit of a critique of that. You're going to hear a lot about a company called Nestle. I'm not trying to pick on Nestle. And the reason I'm using Nestle as an example is because the shared value model was actually, they were one of the first companies to actually implement it in practice. And so Michael Porter and Kramer, they did a lot of work with Nestle in around this, and Nestle has been a prime example of a company that is actually very, very heavily involved in the cocoa supply chain. So it was easy to get some data along those lines as well. So we're going to talk about chocolate. And a lot of people go, well, where does chocolate or cocoa actually come from? It actually, you can see here, this is a cocoa pod. It's actually the seeds or the beans are actually inside. And if you're looking at it right now, you're probably thinking that doesn't look a lot like chocolate, does it? It's actually in its raw form. And what happens is these plants, cocoa trees, they grow these pods originally from South America, but about 70% of the world's supply at the moment actually comes from two Western African countries, which is Ivory Coast and Ghana. We do have some in other countries as well. South America grows a bit originally from South America. Actually, Mexico was where cocoa originated from. And so what happens is that the pods get harvested. They get chopped open, often with a machete like this. The beans that are then taken and put into banana leaves and left to ferment for a few days, 4 or 5 days, and then that develops the cocoa flavor that we're all kind of familiar with. And I want you to take particular note of the those cocoa pods. You know, there's a lot of discoloration. There's a lot of mold or mildew, or they're not perfect specimens of cocoa pods. But this is quite typical of how the cocoa is actually grown in West Africa. The trees are susceptible to diseases and pests and so forth. So that's a normal occurrence in growing cocoa. It's being cut open by looks like a young boy with a machete. It's a very manual process. There's not much smart, how would you call it, industrial type growing going into cocoa production in West Africa. Most cocoa is grown on some very small farm holdings of about 4 or 5 hectares, which about 70 or 80% is actually dedicated to growing cocoa. And it's a manual process. Okay, so very, very much labor, very, very much labor intensive. I got involved in cocoa research through this paper called The Sticky Chocolate Problem, Impression Management and Counter Accounts in the Shaping of Corporate Image. And in this paper, we wrote a fairly hefty critique of Nestle. Again, Nestle was a bit of not so much a target for us, but it was because they were sponsoring some news articles that were written about cocoa production and that appeared in my local Sydney Morning Herald newspaper. So that kind of annoyed me a little bit, that they were actually getting people to write stories about them. And I was looking at how Nestle, as a large corporate, was using their corporate power and their money to, write the news, write the agenda, so to speak. So myself and Chrissy Bernardi and Steph Perkis, we wrote this paper, and we were, how would you call it, getting critiqued by the reviewers on our views of counter accounting. So then we invited Jim Haslam to be a co-author with us, because Jim and his wife Sonia, they basically wrote the book on counter accounts. So we could go back to the reviewers and say, well, we've got the right guy on board to help us with the theory on counter accounting. This paper got a bit of airplay or press from my university once it was accepted in Critical Perspectives on Accounting, as you probably were, a very good journal. And they wrote a little news article about it, and it went out into the news. And then a fellow by the name of Fuzz Kiddo got in contact with me. And Fuzz is a director of an NGO here in Australia called Be Slavery Free. And they were looking at modern slavery or child labor in the cocoa supply chain. And this is what this paper is about, really. It's about Nestle and how they were kind of, how would you call it, using the media and other forms like the internet and so forth to kind of not cover up, but portray their image as a company who really does care about eradicating slave labor and cocoa or child labor from the cocoa industry. And I believe that, actually Nestle is probably one of the companies who's doing a lot of work in this area. We might say not enough work, but because there's still those kind of endemic problems in the industry. So here's a typical example. Here's a young fellow. He's probably the child of a farmer in Africa. And what he's doing there is he's helping on the farm, drying the cocoa beans ready for distribution. This is fairly typical. Probably about 2 million children working in Africa at the moment on farms. Is it helping on the farm, or is it actually child labor, which under international labor conventions would be considered a form of modern slavery? And we say most of it is that form of modern slavery. This is not a kid coming home after school and having a bit of a help on the farm. This is a child who's working on the farm, probably not going to school as often as what they should, even though that situation is getting better, as we'll see later. But doing the work that an adult really should do. But why is the child working on the farm? Well, basically because the farmers are poor. Almost all the farmers in West Africa don't make a living income, and many of them live below the poverty line. So they're very, very poor. It's very labor intensive. They can't afford to hire labor. They can't afford to hire any mechanisms to help them or assist them. So therefore, it's basically themselves, their kids, and maybe some other few people who work on the farms in the area. But it's not exactly a lucrative job to have, to be a cocoa farmer. And the cocoa companies traditionally just do not pay a lot of money for cocoa. The world price, up until just recently, has been very, very depressed, around the $1,800 per ton US. Unfortunately, in Africa at the moment, there's a lot of, problems with supply because of disease and because of climate change. And basically what's happening is that the supply has gone down in Africa, and as supply has gone down, the prices on the open market have gone up. So the farmers are not necessarily getting any more money for their cocoa. It's the traders who are getting more money for the cocoa that actually still exists in the market. Most of the farmers get what they call a farm gate price. These prices are set by the governments of Ivory Coast and Ghana. So they've set the price well before the crop was even in. So unfortunately, the farmers are not doing all that well at the moment. And that's been traditional in West African cocoa farming. United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, probably all familiar with those. The number one of those is no poverty. And that's what we're fighting in the cocoa industry. We're trying to actually make a better life for farmers through our research. But the problem with no poverty, even though it's the primary goal of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, you have another 16 different things that actually contribute towards poverty. So you've actually got to help eradicate all these other issues that are actually in the supply chain or in the economy in order for the farmers to lift themselves out of poverty, which we're trying to help them. So when you look at the cocoa supply chain or the farmers who are growing the cocoa, you look at things like hunger, good health, education, gender equality, water sanitation. I mean, the list goes on. There are all these problems still in West Africa. Are they getting better? Arguably, over the years, yes, things are starting to get better, but they're nowhere near where they need to be in order for the poverty to be eliminated in cocoa farming. So yes, we're struggling with the UN Sustainable Development Goals of trying to achieve them to eliminate poverty in this area. So we, from a theoretical perspective, we deal with this as what we call a wicked problem. So wicked problems are social problems rather than, tame, what they call tame business problem. If you're trying to increase the productivity of your firm, for example, we have a lot of management science that we can apply, and we can apply mechanisms or to actually increase productivity. So we have science that can actually help us do that. Wicked problems are not like that. Wicked problems are really, really complicated social problems that really don't have an agreed on solution, or what they even call a stopping point. So when you say we're going to eliminate poverty, like, so we're going to take poverty as an example, when do we actually know that there is no poverty in the world? It's a relative thing. We're always going to say that somebody is poor or worse off than somebody else. So even we considerably lift the incomes of most people in the world, how can we ever say that poverty has been eliminated? That's a very difficult thing to be able to do. Similar with climate change, similar with organizational sustainability. When do we actually declare that a company or a country or an industry is sustainable? Where do you actually draw that line? So these are kind of like hallmarks of wicked problems. The other issue that we have with wicked problems is that most wicked problems, or not most, but all wicked problems, lots of people have different ideas about how to solve them. So when I'm dealing with poverty in the cocoa industry, we deal with companies, we deal with NGOs, we deal with governments. Everybody has their own ideas or ideologies on how they might resolve this problem. And we don't necessarily agree on how to solve the problem, whereas we might be all in agreement that we need to help resolve it. So wicked problems are very, very complex, very, very complicated. There are no easy answers. We don't really know if or when they are even resolved, but they are of importance. Resolving and lowering poverty throughout the world has been a really important issue that many, many nations have tackled for the last 50 to 100 years and made some significant inroads into. But we continue to do so. This is the project that I've been involved in. It's called the Chocolate Scorecard. You can actually have a look at this. It's just thechocolatescorecard.com. If anybody wants to have a look at that project, all the methodology, all the information about it's on the website. It's quite a good website. This is the project that is run by Be Slavery Free. I'm considered the academic lead. There's myself and from Macquarie University in Sydney, and then there's University of Wollongong and in Australia, and also the Open University in the UK. Have academics from all three of those universities working on the project. The project is headed by Fuzz and Carolyn Kiddo from Be Slavery Free and the board of directors from Be Slavery Free, and a whole bunch of other NGOs as well being involved. So there's a slide with the people involved, and there's, all these organizations are either sponsoring and promoting it for us and or even contributing financially to help that project. So some fairly familiar places, organizations like the World Wildlife Fund, especially in Europe, have been very generous and helping out along with a lot of these other organizations. So it's a big project with a lot of international support in helping eliminate poverty from the cocoa industry, amongst other things. What do? We actually do a sustainability assessment of all the biggest companies in the cocoa supply chain. We estimate the companies that we rank are responsible for about 95% of all the cocoa production in the world. So we basically, we've got a big net. We've caught a lot of companies in the net. One thing I do want to say here, which I think is really, really important about the companies, and regardless of whatever ranking that these companies get in our survey, these companies who we rank, who actually get a score, volunteer. So they're it's not like a lot of these kind of things are like a name and shame type of a project. This is not a name and shame project. This is a name and fame project. So we actually want to find companies who are doing the right thing and actually making improvements to the lives of people who are actually being involved in the cocoa supply chain. So, for example, we're going to be talking about Nestle. Nestle is an active participant in this project. They cooperate, they answer questions, they even attend meetings with us. So they are an active participant in the project trying to make improvements in the supply chain. So we should really thank a lot of the companies in this industry who are actually working towards improving it. And again, as we're going to be reflecting, the focus is, with the companies on their improvements, but is it actually possible for these companies to actually make the improvements themselves? And my argument is basically no. We are actually kind of overlooking a few things. There are a few companies who have decided not to participate, and then you'll see here they'll get a gray one, right? So they're the ones who are not participating in the survey, even though they've been invited to do so. But enough about them. So here's what the scorecard looks like. So this presentation is going to really be looking at one of those aspects, which is called living income. Because living income, if we're going to eliminate poverty, we definitely going to have to make sure that the farmers are achieving what we call living income. And a living income is not just above the poverty line. Living income means you make enough money to support your family, feed your children, make sure everyone's properly clothed, properly has nutritious food, has access to healthcare, has a roof over their heads, safety, security, and possibly a bit of money to save for the future. So living income is being able to earn enough money so that you don't have to worry about paying the bills every week. I mean, that's more or less what we're trying to achieve, right? We do. You'll see here we grade on different aspects: traceability and transparency. In other words, we need to know where the chocolate's grown in order to know whether or not the farmers are getting a living income. We do an assessment of child labor, whether or not there's a lot of children working on the farms. We look at issues of deforestation and climate. We look at a thing called agroforestry because in cocoa, the cocoa trees are often grown in a monoculture environment in the open sun. They're actually not very productive that way. They're much better off grown with other crops in the shade. Cocoa trees are actually a tertiary plant, and they actually are more productive in a more of an environmental setting rather than a monoculture setting. And then we look at the use of pesticides and chemicals as well in that, and then we give an overall score to the firms. We'll see here that only 3 out of the 40 or 50 odd companies that are in the survey actually have policies and practices that guarantee a living income to farmers. So we've got a long way to go before we can say that the farmers are actually coming out of poverty in those areas. The companies you'll see here, one of them we'll talk about a little bit more, Tony's Chocolonely. They've been a fairly standout performer in this survey. Okay, that's them. And Tony's is a very interesting company. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the chocolate scorecard as a research other than as a catalyst to thinking about where this research is going to go in the future, okay? And what happened was that Tony's was a company who made a lot of progress, and you can see here in this picture, they've got a thing called Open Chain. So Tony's developed a system that they could trace where their cocoa was coming from in Africa, and to ensure that issues like their primary thing was to make what they called slave-free chocolate. So they're making sure that there's no modern slavery in their supply chain. There's still some child labor, but they're working towards remediating that. And not only they use this, open chain or more sustainable chocolate in their production, but they also produce it for other companies. So if you're a small producer and you want to have the cocoa beans that are more sustainable, you can buy them from Tony's. They can source them for you. So it's quite an interesting business model that they have. And it was actually a meeting with Tony's. So I was in October of 2023. I was in Amsterdam at the Tony's headquarters, meeting with their sustainability people in charge of the open chain. And they said, we're doing all this wonderful stuff, but what next? Where are we going to go with it? And that's really what got me thinking about what are the ancillary issues that we're having in the cocoa supply chain. Because if we got all these companies and NGOs and governments working towards resolving the problem, and the problem's not being resolved yet, then maybe we need to rethink the approach that we're having to resolving these problems and or issues. So I took one step back and said, well, it's a good way to understand how something works is to think about the history of growing cocoa and where does it come from, right? And one thing I do know about West Africa and a lot of Africa and South America and other places is that it was definitely impacted by Western and European colonialism going back, 500 or 600 years. And West Africa is no different. So it's had the influence of the French, the English, the Portuguese, the Germans. They've been overrun by people who have, taken their own political and or economic interests in there, and through colonialism. So when we talk about colonialism, we mean the action or process of settling among and establish control over the indigenous people of an area, and generally for the purpose of controlling the resources. Okay, so Africa and South America, for example, even Australia, definitely been widely impacted by this process of colonialism. And in Africa, cocoa growing was first started on two islands in San Tome and Principe, two very small islands off the coast of Western Africa. And the cocoa growing started there in the late 1800s. And even though, according to the Western world, slavery was abolished back by the British and most other Western countries by the 1860s and 70s, was pretty much wiped out from an official perspective. In other words, the process of owning somebody and getting them to work for you was no longer legal. However, agriculture and so forth still needed lots of people, and they did need people to work. But the Portuguese would then take African people from what was basically now Angola, and they would take them against their will and then bring them in front of a judge. And the judge would say, do you agree to work for a contract for 5 years and get paid for it? And they would, of course, say yes. And then they would be taken to these islands to work. The death rate in those islands was about 1 in 5. In other words, about 20% of the people who worked on those islands of those days actually passed away because of the conditions. And this was investigated by a British man by the name of Henry Nevinson, and he actually wrote a book back in the early 1900s, and he called it A Modern Slavery, and he was talking about the cocoa production in these two islands. And they're very, very profitable, very, very profitable plantations growing cocoa there. And that's how England and America got their chocolate and cocoa very cheap. So this kind of free labor, so to speak, has been a endemic in the history of cocoa production. And now what do we have? We now have farmers who are living in poverty and or under the not making a living income, and they use the children on the farms still to this day because they need labor, and that's the only way they can get people to work. And cocoa industry is, how would you call it? Living off the fruits of this labor. I call this a form of corporate colonialism these days. So this is kind of a definition that I've come up with. And I define it as the action or process of multinational corporations establishing control over production systems of people in an area, then exert significant influence with the support of governments. And it's about resource extraction, controlling markets, controlling labor practices, and ensuring that there are favorable economic policies put in place by the governments of these countries. So when you look at Ivory Coast and Ghana, it's brown gold, basically, cocoa. And if the beans were to stop flowing in these countries, it would have a very, very significant economic impact. And at the moment, there's some shortages in supplies, and there is some economic impact going on at the moment. But when you have a look at the companies, the Nestle's, the Hershey's, the Mars, the Mondelez, these are all huge, huge, big companies. They could probably afford to pay a lot more for the cocoa, but they don't want to. They're always about the market, the open price, and so forth. But the problem is that the majority of the market is actually controlled by very few people. And the multinational companies are trying to get their cocoa for as cheap as possible because it's an input into a production system. So I'm just going to kind of show you how this actually works and what I mean by the cocoa supply chain being controlled by not only by companies, but by economies. And this is an example of a breakdown of the cost of cocoa. So if you go if you're in Europe, in France, and you went to buy a cocoa bar or block of chocolate per kilo, it's about €8 per kilo, something like that. And who are the people who actually get the money for the cocoa? So when we have a look at this, what we see is that most of it is produced at the top. This is the global north, and the rest of it is here, which is the global south, which is Africa. Okay, so when we have a look at the breakdown of costs, we see that most of the value added is actually being done in Europe, and not much of the value added is actually being done in Africa. Okay. And what is really interesting here is that European governments or Western governments are also benefiting quite nicely because they collect the taxes from the profits. So, for example, in Europe, if you go to your local shop and you buy a block of chocolate, they have a VAT, a value-added tax, which is about 20%. So what is actually happening is that when you're buying your chocolate, you're paying your tax, and the governments in Europe are actually profiting or collecting a lot of revenue out of that cocoa. And when you add it up, there's actually more than what the cocoa farmers are actually getting. So we have the companies making some money out of it. Of course, there's costs associated, so they get some profit. But companies out of a kilo of chocolate would probably make about 78 cents. There's about 71 cents in taxes. The manufacturer is getting about 88 cents a kilo, and the governments are getting about 20 cents a kilo. So when you see the taxes that are accruing to the Western governments, there's about 92 cents. So the governments actually make more money out of cocoa than even the companies do. The problem that we have is when we look down below here, when we look down below, we have the farmer down here. Now, the farmer from cocoa cultivation gets about €1.05. but that's not profit. That's actually revenue. And the farmer's costs are about €1.04. So the farmer's barely breaking even, and that's why the farmers are poor. There's some collection and export and so forth, so some costs here. This is actually what goes on in the supply chain in Africa. And when you have a look at the taxes that are actually collected by the African governments, we're looking at about 18 cents in the kilo compared to 90 cents in the kilo. So not much tax is even being generated or revenue to help with infrastructure in Europe. So here, a lot of this is because we have very, very strong European legislation. For example, in cocoa, some European legislation that's really impacting at the moment is the deforestation legislation. So in other words, if you are growing cocoa on land that's been deforested since December 2020, you won't be allowed to sell that in Europe, or if you do sell it in Europe, the company who's actually using it could be fined up a significant proportion of their income or their turnover. So that's basically blocking any future expansion of cocoa farms into deforested or virgin forests in Africa and throughout the world. So this is actually a limiting factor. So what we actually see here is that the European Union, of course, they're very interested in making sure that they maintain revenues and so forth for their member states. So this is a supply chain that is actually reinforced through legislation to make sure that it remains the way it is. And of course, the farmers, distributors, and governments in West Africa are the ones who are paying the price. The business model that's associated with this is what we call shared value. And if anyone's familiar with shared value, it comes out of the US. The famous Michael Porter, Professor Porter, and another guy, consultant, Kramer, they developed this. And what they're saying is that there's a mutual dependence of corporations and society implies that both businesses and social policies must follow the principle of shared value. And that is, choices must benefit both sides. So what they're saying is that, well, when we deal with these companies in Africa, we've got to make sure that they get benefit as well as the companies are getting benefit out of it, which actually sounds quite good. So, this is their view towards sustainability. And I studied this actually at Harvard because during COVID, I had sitting in my office in Sydney and not much else to do, or sitting in my home in Sydney, not much else to do. So I did a couple of online courses with the Harvard Business School, and one of them was on sustainability management. And this concept of shared value was being touted as the way forward. This is how we're going to run sustainable businesses and supply chains in the future. And as I said, I'm not trying to pick on Nestle, but when you actually read the literature about shared value, you'll discover that shared value Nestle was really Porter and Kramer's first client. One of the first clients, I think they were the first client. And Nestle really got into it. And not only did they get into it with Porter and Kramer and apply it, but they actually called their sustainability reports shared value reports. So this is a reason that I'm singling out Nestle, not because I'd like to pick on them or anything, but because they actually are the ones that helped or worked with Porter and Kramer on developing this as a concept, right? So Nestle's argument is that for a business to be successful in the long term, it has to create value not only for its shareholder, but its society. So they call this creating shared value. And I think this is a form of corporate colonialism because you could actually read in what they're saying. They actually say we need to create value for the people in the countries where we are present. So Nestle, a big multinational corporation, of course, based in Switzerland, which doesn't have enough, the kind of natural resources that you would need to grow cocoa. It's too cold there, so obviously they have to get their raw materials from externally, and places like Africa and South America and so forth. So they are always on the lookout for the commodities that they need to produce their products. And Porter and Kramer really came up with this concept because, you know, companies were, how would you call it, being criticized a lot for basically going in to places like Africa and taking without giving anything back. So it was a, how would you call it? I would call it a more of an altruistic form of trying to do business, where they were saying that, okay, we need to make money, and we need to actually give benefit to the people in those countries, right? But this still is very much a Western concept. You know, we have big Western, or what we call global North businesses, dealing with the global South and controlling their supplies. So, you know, cocoa growing in Africa, if they didn't have it, there would be it would be a big detriment to their economies. But is shared value the answer? So that's the question I really started asking myself when I started looking at this concept of shared value, because we still have these problems with poverty and poor farmers and children working on farms and the other sustainability problems that we have in the cocoa supply chain. And I've been working with Be Slavery Free. This is my 4th year working on the chocolate scorecard. But this is the chocolate scorecard, or some version of it. It's been going on for nearly 15 years. And yet we still are talking about the same problems. I'm going, well, why is that? And shared value has been around since then too. So 2006-07 is when they first started implementing it. 2008, I think, was the first Nestle shared value report. So Nestle has been talking about shared value for a long time as well. And we wanted to say, well, is this actually working, right? So Nestle's argument is that, and this is from their annual review in 2018, we understand the challenges farmers face. We can improve productivity and incomes and make agriculture a more attractive and secure long-term supplies. So that's what shared value is at. It's not only just about ensuring that the farmers continue to grow cocoa. Nestle needs these products. They need them in the long term. So they're trying to ensure that they have adequate sources of raw materials at an attractive price in order to keep their business going. So shared value is not about paying more money for cocoa. And let's be frank about this, right? If Nestle decided to pay the farmers more money, they could instantly raise their incomes significantly. And that's not just Nestle, that's all the players in the cocoa industry. They could go around and pay everybody, what we call a living income price for their cocoa, because there is a reference price that per kilo. We know that it is possible because we saw that with Tony's Chocolate Only. Tony's Chocolate Only is one of the only 3 companies that we have recognized as paying a living income to their farmers. But if you go and buy a block of Tony's Chocolate Only, you'll notice it actually costs considerably more than a block of Nestle chocolate, and that's because they have higher expenses because they give more money to farmers. So shared value is not about giving a bigger piece of the pie to the farmers. What shared value is about is increasing productivity. In theory, this is the theory, and to make a bigger pie. So we're going to try to make a bigger pie so that you can have more income. So we're going to try to help you grow more cocoa. If you grow more cocoa, then you get more money, so to speak. But that's got some very simple supply and demand economics kind of a problem to it. And if we look historically, that is the problem. There's also some farmers say get some more money through fair trade. That's another way that farmers get more money. But really, fair trade gives farmers maybe 10 or 20% more money, not that much. It's really not going to raise their income so that they will be significantly better off. Whereas Nestle and Porter and Kramer are arguing that shared value might lift incomes by about 300% or triple their profits. Well, that would be nice, but we'll see if that's actually been happening. So here's, you can read all of that, but I just highlighted one of them in red. This is what they've been talking about for a long time. Basically, what they're saying with shared value is that we could actually help the farmers grow between 50 to 200% more cocoa. And their goal was to get about 1,500 kilos of cocoa per hectare, which is considerably up from about 500 or 600 kilos per hectare where they are, or they traditionally were, and really haven't gone much beyond that. We'll see that in a minute. But that was the idea, right? Let's help them grow more cocoa per hectare. Well, not only are we going to try to help them grow more cocoa per hectare, but we also want to do good for society, right? So, for example, this is from the Nestle Cocoa Plan. So Nestle is enacting the shared value model through the Nestle Cocoa Plan. And what are they doing? They're helping improve education, making sure the kids go to school. They're teaching them how to grow different crops so that they can have better income. They're actually telling them how to sell those crops when the farmers have better income. It's a very nice ideological thing. So, nice Western view. We're all very nice people. We're going around helping the people of Africa. We're sending them to school. We're teaching them agriculture. We're teaching them how to live better lives, and so on and so forth. So this is a real when it's run by a company. This is in my view is a perfect example of corporate colonialism. So is shared value actually increasing productivity? So these numbers are actually out of the Nestle annual reports. So these are not numbers that I've picked up elsewhere about Nestle. So the source is Nestle. And as you can see, back in 2000, or earlier on, they were saying we'd like to get the farmers up to 1,500 kilos per hectare. And we'll take a very bit of a closer look. These are actually the figures from 2001, 22, and 23 in Ivory Coast and Ghana. And you can see that I think the highest they had was 635 kilos per hectare in 2021. And in fact, you can see that productivity is actually falling, not increasing. There's lots of problems at the moment with what they call swollen shoot disease, where the roots of the plants become swollen and they don't operate properly, and therefore it reduces the productivity of the trees. Particularly a big problem in Ghana, where they're actually ripping out, I think, about 500,000 hectares worth of cocoa trees at the moment and replanting them with disease-resistant varieties. They have to do that. And the productivity in cocoa is definitely not on the rise. And with all the work that Nestle has been doing with training farmers and trying to improve the types of plants and so forth that they're growing, improving farming practices, it's just not been happening. So shared value, increased productivity, nice idea, but the evidence that we have from Africa at the moment is that it's not working at all. The espoused productivity increases are just not happening. Even if it was successful, would it actually mean more income? Probably not. This graph here shows you the volatility of cocoa pricing. So this is just simple supply and demand economics. If you have a bigger supply, what's generally going to happen if the demand hasn't gone up equally is that prices will fall because there's excess products on the market. So back around 2009, the price of cocoa went up to about $3,000 per ton. That spurred off another growth in people going, well, that's a great price. I'd love to get that for my cocoa. So they increased production. As soon as they increased production, what happened? The the price of cocoa fell considerably. Happened again in 2018. 14, sorry, the price went up again to a little over $3,000 per ton. More and more cocoa came into production, and as a result, a 38% decrease in pricing. So shared value says, let's make a bigger piece of the pie so you can earn some more money. That's great if you can do that while you increase the demand at the same time. And unfortunately, even what's been happening in Africa is that when we're talking about increases in supply, it's not about increases because of productivity, as we can see. It's because they went around and chopped down more forests. So the problem that we have, for example, in the Ivory Coast is that about 80% of the forests have been basically eradicated, and most of that's gone to new cocoa farms. And why? Because it takes less time and less labor to go and chop down the trees and burn the trees and plant cocoa than it does to rip out the old trees and plant a new plantation. So it was a shortcut that the farmers made, and they didn't have to buy the land because they're basically going into the protected forests and chopping them down. So this is what's been driving a lot of the problems with climate change and so forth in Africa at the moment, or in that part of Africa. So does shared value increase farmer income? The answer is really no. We've got the problems with climate, and they're playing havoc. So productivity is down. This is just a comment from last year. A few seasons ago, 1 hectare would yield about 600 kilos. Now some farmers are lucky to get 300 kilos. They're barely surviving. Arguably, I think in Africa at the moment, we've reached what we call a tipping point. Production is in long-term decline. In Africa, last year they got the lowest crop in 20 years for Ghana and 8 years in the Ivory Coast. So we're starting to see continual lower harvests in Africa, and we believe that's a structural problem. So we believe that at the moment, farmers are going to continue to be worse off in Africa because the growing conditions are such that it's going to lead to lower productivity overall in the economy or in the industry. So really, that wicked problem is getting much, much more complex. And then, so if that wicked problem in Africa is getting much more complex, how is that possibly going to be resolved, if it can be resolved? And my argument is really, with the evidence that I've seen, I think Africa is going to have a continual decline in cocoa production, and other places in the world, such as South America, are going to start picking up some of the slack. And we're seeing that at the moment. So we're also seeing this shared value, which is about helping improve the lives of people, might have some unintended consequences too. So we're seeing a huge change in population demographics, which make impact the cheap farm labor. There is a huge need to renovate the farms. However, even though they do know that they need to change something as far as the farming practice is concerned, not much is happening, or not enough is happening. And we're going to see the impact of that in another market, which is South America, and how they're actually filling the gap without what we call the African unsustainability issue. So those are kind of 3 points that we'll discuss to close off the seminar. So here's a picture, typical farmer. He's got 2 wives and 7 kids. Why does he have 2 wives and 7 kids? Because he needs people on the farm. Traditionally, that's what they do. And unfortunately, the average farmer is getting older because there's not as many younger people taking up cocoa farming. Not exactly an attractive industry to be in if you're basically insured a life of poverty or barely eking out an existence, right? They have an average household size of 10.6 people, or 7.5 when excluding dependents who may or may not be relatives. So there's a lot of people working on the cocoa farms. They're fairly large households, and it's because that's the way they make a living. They work fairly cheaply on the farms. That's the way things are at the moment. What is actually improving in Africa? So since 2016, for example, in Ivory Coast, education has become compulsory, and we're seeing more and more children actually completing school. So, sorry, go back one. In primary school, about 68-69% males and females finish primary school. Secondary school completion rates a bit lower for females, 55 as opposed to 60. And then we go on to tertiary and even universities, up to 9 or 11% are actually finishing higher education. So education is becoming more prevalent. And if you look at things like the Nestle Cocoa Plan, the corporate colonialism is about making sure that children are going to school. They have been relatively successful in increasing the number of hours or educational levels of children in those areas, so that's good. Is it perfect? No. If you've heard of the Human Capital Index, which is a score out of 100, basically, for progress, the Human Capital Index, which measures health, educational, and income, Ivory Coast is still sitting at about 38 over 100. So they've got a long way to go to improve, but they have been continually improving. So there is, as I said before, some progress. But what is the impact of that progress as you lift people out of poverty and you educate people more, especially women? Well, the first thing that happens is that birth rates go down. Here, I'm actually showing some statistics. Here's the Ivory Coast, going back in the year 2000, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. They had a birth rate of about nearly 6 live births per woman, and that has now fallen down to about 4. The Ghana is even more. In 2000, there were about 5 live births, and the fertility rate now is about 3.5. So what we're seeing here on the other axis is that this is directly related to the number of schooling years that women get. So what we're seeing is that as shared value kicks in, and we're doing the right thing, and we're educating people in the global south, what's happening at the same time is that people are having less and less children. And why? Because women that are educated will say, well, I don't really need to live with a poor farmer. I have now other choices in my life because of my education. I can be a nurse. I can be a teacher. I can run my own business. I can have lots of other options in my life other than just being a wife of a poor farmer and have babies, and so that we can regenerate the farm, so to speak. In the future, I've kind of predicted that, the way things are going, Ivory Coast will hit 3 fairly shortly, and Ghana in the next decade or so is going to continue to fall. So if those trends keep going, what's going to really happen is that the birth rates are going to go down so low that the cheap children or child labor on the farms is going to actually kind of evaporate, because there just won't be that many children available to work on the farms. So that's kind of like an ancillary, unintended consequence of the shared value model. What else is actually happening in Africa as well? This is a report by one of the chocolate companies. And really, what they're recognizing is that they have to do something about regenerating farms. But unfortunately, at the moment, in Ivory Coast, for example, the Council of Cocoa and Coffee, which is like the government regulator, right, is actually preventing the cocoa companies, and this is from Cargill, which is one of the bigger producers, is actually preventing them from helping farmers regenerate their land. I don't know what's behind this policy. It's something that I need to do a bit more research on myself. But here we have a situation where we know we need to improve the farms. We know we need to improve productivity and to ensure a future, and yet it's being prevented from being happening. So something's amiss there that needs resolving. And this is another report from Barry Callebaut. Barry Callebaut is the biggest processor of cocoa. So they take the raw beans and they process it into cocoa butter, cocoa liquor, cocoa powder, that type of thing, and then sell it on to other people. They have, of course, a very vested interest in making sure that shared value works, so that they have a supply of cocoa. And what they're saying is really the only answer is reforestation strategies and production of the same amount of cocoa in less land. And note, they didn't say that that had to happen in Africa, even though they were talking about Africa at the same time. And that's really where we're at with this at the moment. And where the cocoa is being more cocoa is being grown is actually in Brazil. Now, most people would not have heard of Brazilian cocoa. Brazil is actually a country that consumes a lot of chocolate. They love the stuff there. But most of the cocoa that's actually consumed in Brazil is grown in Brazil. And remember, I showed you that picture a bit earlier about the cocoa pods, the young man chopping them open and all the discoloration and so forth. This is what it looks like in Africa, right? The cocoa that is actually being grown there is much healthier. It's much more productive. And what they're doing is they're actually growing cocoa on reforested land. So they do recognize that cocoa production is not suitable to monoculture. So they're growing it with other plants, such as pepper and bananas and palm oil and that type of thing. And they're actually growing them with proper irrigation. When they harvest it, they're controlling the fermentation. So their productivity in these new reforested areas is actually very, very significant, much bigger. At the moment, some areas can produce up to 3,000 kilos per hectare, which when we look at what's happening in Africa, we're getting between 300 and 600 kilos. So we're getting up to 10 times the productivity in areas in Brazil, which are using more professional and more scientific ways of actually growing the cocoa in better conditions, right? In the Brazil's Amazonian state of Pará, typically they're getting around 2,000 kilograms per hectare. So they're growing, and this stuff is also very high quality. So they're growing high quality, they're being much more productive, and there are huge moves to increase productivity in Brazil at the moment because of the problems that they're having in Africa. This is actually causing a lot of companies. This is an example of a local company to Australia, or not Australia, to New Zealand. Whittaker's is one of the companies who's been doing a lot of work in Africa themselves, trying to secure their own supplies. And they've been basically getting most of their stuff from particular growers in Ghana, and they just can't keep up anymore. So they've actually, they're going to be looking for new sources, and that's actually what's happening. These cocoa companies, the chocolate scorecards identifying them, the things aren't changing in Africa, the government policies aren't working to make significant changes or to increase productivity or secure supplies or to make sure children are not working on farms and so forth. So the change has been that slow, and the companies are going to getting sick of kind of getting beaten up by people or criticized by people for what's going on in Africa. So basically, if they get the source of cocoa from Brazil, for example, The cocoa in Brazil is being grown on big plantations through reforestation, have better labor laws. So a lot of the problems that you have with growing cocoa in Africa go away when you start buying cocoa from places like Brazil. There are other countries such as Nigeria and Cameroon who are starting to pick up the slack a little bit, but only slightly. In fact, in Nigeria, cocoa production has been impacted as well. So it's down by, I think, 4%. Cameroon's increased a little bit by 5%, but we're talking very, very small numbers compared to the numbers that are coming out of Africa. So just to kind of finish off some conclusions. Yes, shared value, I believe, is a form of corporate colonialism. It's a failed business model, as we can see in Africa, that it doesn't increase productivity. Mohammed, you've got a question? Sabra? Put your hand up. Yes.
Sabra, you can ask. Open your mic and ask your question.
Hello.
Yes.
I'd probably prefer to leave you to finish the conclusions. I would just
okay.
After conclusions.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah.
So shared value is a fair business model that doesn't sustainably increase production. We can see that. The value capture from shared value really goes to the companies and the governments and doesn't get shared with the local farmers. There are social and environmental realities of shared value that are not being recognized by key stakeholders. And what in Africa, the way things are, the wicked problem of poverty in cocoa farming is definitely going to remain. And the big question really is it actually possible to grow more cocoa on less land in Africa? The implications for the future, really, what I believe, the whole issue about productivity, poverty, child labor, and sustainability, they're wicked problems. They have no easy answer, especially in the African situation. They do need to change their strategies, but because we know that the current strategies are unsustainable. The big question is, will the cocoa companies abandon West Africa and turn to the more productive and high-tech plantations that we see in Central and South America? My answer, I think, is yes, that's going to happen. Will the West African governments be able to react and see the writing on the wall and radically change and deal with the issues of declining birth rates? And because the women and men of Africa are no longer going to see cocoa as a viable lifestyle, so it's going to radically change even what's going on today. And really, is this concept of shared value partly to blame for reaching that tipping point? And I think we're going to just leave it at that and open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, dear Professor John, for your contribution and your effort. It's really an excellent presentation and excellent paper. Thank you very much. Now, if anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Mohammed Sabri. Mohammed Sabr.
Mohammed Sabra. So thank you very much, John, for a very, very informative and lovely presentation. Honestly, I enjoyed a lot of it. And forgive me for being a little bit maybe too critical, but I think one of the major issues that we have when it comes to sort of post-colonial accounting research and yours and the presentation that you gave, it has this, at least in my opinion, a very, let's say, an undertone of sort of the very Western dominant ideas. Yes. In for example, when we speak about the companies that are involved in the cocoa production and how they have a responsibility to sort of alleviate some of the poverty and the problems that the people in the African countries are facing. And I think it's just sort of reiterates the same ideas of the West has this responsibility to sort of civilize the uncivilized, or educate the uneducated. And I think it takes a lot of the agency from the indigenous sort of people living in those regions.
Absolutely.
And I think it might be helpful, and it might be a good idea to look from, rather than a post-colonial sort of perspective, maybe look towards the subject from a decolonial sort of perspective, trying to introduce more of the local ideas, and how the local populations can themselves sort of free themselves from the oppression that they are facing.
No, I totally agree with you, and that is kind of like research that you really need to get it down on the ground with those people and talk to them. One of the nice things is that Fuzz and a few of the others that I'm working with actually do go to Africa, and they do visit the farmers, and they do talk to them, and I would love to do more research around that area. So I do take your points on quite well. I'm trying to really make the point that we have too much of this post-colonialism going on. Like, we still treat this as a Western problem. Even the whole concept of sustainable development. Sustainable development from whose perspective? I mean, you almost have you have to accept that that sustainable development is all about bringing so-called global South up to par with the global North, and because we're developed, and we could open a whole can of worms on that one, but that's not really the ideology of what I'm trying to do. Is probably agree with you in giving a critique of here's this so-called Harvard experts and coming out and saying this is a way that we're going to save the world, and in fact what they're doing is actually doing quite the opposite of it. In actual fact, they're these business models that they're imposing on the people in Africa, because that's exactly what it is. It's still a form of colonialism, and that's actually having detrimental impacts on not only their incomes, but on their culture and their society. So your comment about how do we actually reverse that is a very good question. I don't have the answer, and that's why we call it a wicked problem, because I think this is you're totally right. It's so much more complicated, and probably much more complicated than we can do it justice in an hour and a bit online. Okay.
Masoud?
Hi everyone, and thank you for a very informative presentation. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, I can hear you.
Right. I think all what has been said, I fully agree with. The shared value, as I understand it, is a smoke screen. It was a reaction to the maximization of shareholder value that was imposed through the mechanisms that I think we all know. The shared value, when you go back and forgot the names, I think, was it Friedman, whatever, they started distancing themselves when people started exposing that scam, if you like, and they started trying to show themselves in good light by saying, oh no, we are human beings at the end of the day, and we're not that bad. But I think the issues, as you rightly describe them, in the cocoa thing is just an example. Child labor covers all sorts of other areas, even for example, making clothes in Bangladesh and selling them in stores in Europe. So the issue is not like the shared value is not going to give them anything. What is, I believe, the center of what should be the center of discussion is the capitalist model will, with all its flaws,
Mm.
And I don't think it is fixable because they want it to be that way, including organizations that claim to do the opposite, like the WEF, which is just another horrible
Yep.
institution.
Yep.
So I don't think it is fixable, and I think the best way is for, and I believe some African countries, I can't remember the names, I think they managed to, free themselves from huge amounts of debt and so on by just forgetting about the European, whatever, American capitalist model, because it is a model that is not working in America, it's not working in Europe, it's broken.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We live here. I'm in the UK, and a lot of people live under the poverty line.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is no source of justice. The whole damn thing is broken. Okay. The crime is everywhere, and so on.
Yeah.
So people in Africa, if they think by following in the footsteps of these organizations, they're going to solve their problems. I think they're totally mistaken. I think the advice should be given to them to turn your back, forget about this. This is a broken system. It's not going to help you. And if you want to test it, and this is probably one point I would like to make, if they want to test it in terms of the companies like Nestle, whether they're really, whether they're sincere about, helping with this and helping with that, I say, okay, what drives you, Nestle and others, in, buying things? You may blame the cooperatives. You say, look, we're not forcing the farmers in any way because we don't deal with them directly. But at the end of the day, what is driving you is to make sure that you have dividends paid to your shareholders.
Absolutely.
Isn't it? Now, as a possible solution, say, look, let's test you for that. Okay.
Yeah.
Why not change a key feature of the current stock market capitalist model? So why not include these impoverished farmers as recipients of distributable after-tax profits?
Exactly.
Right. So alongside the ordinary shareholders, okay, these countries, whatever, they come up with laws and say, look, this amount, should go to these people. Okay.
Yeah, I agree, and that's the problem is that this form of corporate colonialism is that these companies have turnovers that are bigger than the economies of these countries.
Absolutely.
And then another one of my presentations, I did a comparison of the amount of money that Nestle makes every year compared to actually how much money the Ivory Coast makes out of cocoa, and Nestle makes a lot more money in general than a country, and so therefore this is this whole plutocracy, the ability of the people who have lots of money to influence the politics and the resources of these countries, and this is we say it all the time to the companies, living income. Let's just make sure we have a living income. And they say, well, how do we do that? And said, we just pay them more for their cocoa. And it's just, as soon as you say that to them, it's like, no, this is why they want the shared value model.
Yeah, but thank you, John. There are probably indirect ways. If they say, look, we can't pay more, blah, blah, and they throw at you the market, this is how market pricing and whatever, you can come at them indirectly and say, look, okay, let's give part of the after-tax profit, distribute some of that, okay, to these farmers, and show that you really mean business by giving them a decent living income. And the second point, because these large companies, this is a fact, it's been known for decades, they externalize costs onto society. Okay, why not then make it formal, obviously through, credible organizations and governments, to charge these businesses for the social costs they create?
Exactly.
So I think there has to be this type of mechanism, because otherwise, if you go to them and say, look, I need you to pay a little bit more for the cocoa, they will always wriggle out of that.
Exactly. But what the major then problem is, and then I think Gore Brundtland really said it in Our Common Future. She said sustainability is achievable, but it's going to take a lot of political will to make it happen. And the problem is, who is going to actually have that political will to make it happen? And if people aren't voting in the governments that actually give that political will, then it just doesn't happen. We've just seen a major change in politics again in the US. So it's kind of been a reversal again. You guys have had the same issues there in the UK. You've had a major change in government that hasn't happened, and that's the power of democracy getting involved. And hopefully then the politicians who are then being voted in, well, they get voted in with the power that they've been given by their constituents. European legislators have been the same. Why do we have these deforestation laws in Europe? Is because some people in Europe are pushing the politicians to say we shouldn't be buying our goods from land that's being deforested elsewhere in the world for our benefit. So they put these laws in to say, no, we're going to have the EU deforestation legislation. Sounds all fantastic on paper, but you go talk to a farmer in West Africa, because now there's extra work involved in certifying the cocoa and stuff. And he said, well, we will comply, but who's paying for it? So in actual fact, the kind of legislation that's being implemented, the cost or the burden of actually making that work is then being transferred back on to the people in Africa who actually don't have the resources to do it. And then the governments in Africa, they have to comply, because if they don't comply, they don't sell cocoa. So they're kind of trapped in that kind of a power vacuum. And this is just part of all the intricacies that make this a wicked problem. Is there actually a right answer? Is there a way of actually 100% resolving this? And I don't think there is, to be honest with you, but it shouldn't stop us from working towards resolving the problems. That's all.
Thank you.
There is another question. Mohammed, you have another question?
Forgive me for having to come in.
I think one of the things that I was trying to say, and one of the things that I'm noticing as well in the little conversation that you had with Masroud is, again, we're looking at Western countries and Western companies to solve problems that are in Africa. And I think it's really important for the local populations over in Africa to sort of, first of all, organize. I mean, cocoa farmers could do something like unionization, and they could sort of control the supply. And then sort of also control how the market operates and the prices that they are being paid for the commodities that they have. I think when we look, I don't think that the people who created the problem, Western and capitalist sort of companies, are the ones to look at in fixing those problems. That's what I'm trying to say.
Agreed. No, I would agree with you on that point. And that's one of the problems that we have. We always, even in the Western view, we say, oh, these are big, powerful companies. Let's make them solve the problems. And my argument is not that's up them to be solving the problems. The reality is it takes a multi-stakeholder approach. You have to have the inputs from the people on the ground, the farmers. You have to have the inputs from the governments. You have to have the inputs from the businesses themselves, because it's an ecosystem. And if you break one part of the system, then maybe something else is going to fail. When people found out there was child labor in cocoa, they said, "Oh, we should ban cocoa from Africa." And well, that might even create a bigger problem, because you have so many people relying on it for income. Imagine if all of a sudden they had no income whatsoever. That would probably cause more social harm and unrest than trying to resolve it in another way. So that's, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, so to speak. So that's the problem that we have. And I think that's really the intricacies of the problem. And, when we have things like climate change coming in, and where the farmers have absolutely no control over the situation whatsoever, because the damage has already been done, so to speak. What do we do then? So I think it's going to be very interesting. It's going to be very, very interesting to follow what's going to be happening or is happening in Africa over the next few years. I think there's going to be some radical change. I don't think it's going to get any better any sooner. And if anything, it may even get worse before it gets better. That's the way I see it. And we're going to have some radical change in the industry with all this production coming online in Central and South America. So it's going to be a very, very interesting next 5 or 10 years in the industry.
Yeah, and just to comment on that, as I said, don't try and at least try in your research not to frame it as a problem that the Western countries or the Western companies need to solve, because that would sound very patronizing, which is a lot of, actually very surprisingly, a lot of post-colonial studies sound the same way. It's up to the West to solve their problems caused by the West in the East. And I think this is a very sort of patronizing idea. And along with that, I'd say as well, decolonial theory. Now, decolonial is different from post-colonial. I think you could grow from decolonial theory in more on your research ideas as well. It's really interesting, and I really want to thank you for a very, very informative and a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Are there another questions? If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Thank you very much, dear Professor John, for your contribution and your effort. Thank you, everyone joining us today. Thank you very much for taking the time to present to us today, dear Professor John. It's been appreciated. Thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and I hope to see you soon in Egypt. You are very, very welcome.
I will. I'll look you up for sure.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.